The Cleveland Browns just made a move that has the entire NFL world talking, and the reaction from the critics has been nothing short of spectacular. Andrew Berry, the Browns' general manager, went out and signed left guard Chris Paul from the Washington Commanders to anchor the offensive line in front of Shedeur Sanders. The moment that news broke, the critics came out swinging with everything they had. People who had never heard of the player 1 minute were suddenly declaring the signing a catastrophic mistake the next. This is the story of why those critics are wrong, why Chris Paul is exactly the right move for this franchise, and why this signing tells you everything you need to know about what Cleveland is truly building around their future quarterback. Let's start with the facts of the signing itself. Andrew Berry identified Chris Paul as a free agent target coming out of Washington, where he had developed into a legitimate starting left guard over the course of the season. The Browns moved quickly and brought him in to fill one of the most critical needs on the entire roster, protection for a young quarterback who is stepping into the biggest role of his professional career. This was not a random decision. This was not a panic move. This was a calculated, front office level decision to address a specific, documented weakness before that weakness could derail everything the organization is trying to build. The immediate reaction from the critics, however, told a completely different story. The response was instant and it was loud. One commentator, Bull, jumped on the news and admitted openly that he had never even heard of Chris Paul before the signing was announced. That admission alone should have ended the argument right there on the spot. If you do not know who the player is, if you cannot name a single snap he has taken, if you cannot describe a single game where you watched him play, then you do not have the foundation to declare the signing a mistake with any credibility. But instead of pausing and doing the basic homework, the criticism escalated rapidly. First, the player was unknown. Then he suddenly became overpriced. Then within minutes of the announcement, he had transformed in the minds of these critics into one of the worst run blockers in the entire league. The speed of that transformation was remarkable, and it reveals exactly what was really driving the reaction. It was never about Chris Paul. It was never about the contract details or the positional value or the scheme fit. It was about Shedeur Sanders and the very real fear that Cleveland is actually putting together the pieces to make him successful. Now let's get into who Chris Paul actually is and what he actually accomplished in Washington, because the critics certainly were not going to do that work before opening their mouths. Chris Paul was not handed anything during his time with the Commanders. Like most young offensive linemen entering the league, he rotated in and out of the lineup in the early stages of his development, learning the system, working on his technique, and waiting for his opportunity. Washington had already invested in another young guard they expected to start ahead of him. The competition was legitimate and the outcome was not predetermined. But when that competition played out on the actual football field, Chris Paul won. He did not win through politics or through a coaching staff doing him any favors. He outperformed his competition directly and earned the starting job through better play. Once he locked down that starting role, he did not let go of it. The growth he demonstrated across that season was significant and measurable. Week after week, his pass protection improved in ways that showed up clearly on tape. His understanding of stunts, games, and blitz pickups sharpened. His communication with the center and the tackles on either side of him became more consistent and more reliable. By the end of the year, he was a fundamentally different player compared to where he had started. His pass protection numbers ranked among the best at his position across the entire league that season. This was not luck and it was not a statistical fluke. This was a young player developing in real time under real conditions on a team that was competing for meaningful football games. The Cleveland Browns watched every bit of that development. Andrew Berry's scouting staff tracked his progress throughout the season and identified exactly the kind of player who was emerging from that Washington system. A guard who fights for his position, earns it through direct competition on the field, and keeps improving once he has consistent starting representatives. That is precisely the profile a rebuilding offensive line needs to add. Cleveland did not sign a mystery player. They signed a player on a clear upward trajectory at exactly the right moment, before the rest of the league could catch up to the value they were offering. Now it is time to take apart the specific arguments the critics made after the signing was announced, because each one deserves to be examined on its actual merits. The first argument was the simplest and the weakest: nobody has heard of him, so the signing must be bad. This is one of the most hollow arguments in all of sports commentary, and it surfaces every single time a front office makes a move that involves a player outside the mainstream spotlight. The NFL operates with 32 rosters carrying 53 men each. There are hundreds of players making significant contributions every single week that the average fan and even the average commentator have never tracked in detail. Unfamiliarity does not equal worthlessness. The fact that Bull admitted he did not know the player and then immediately pivoted to criticizing the contract value tells you that the analysis was never grounded in anything real. You cannot assess a contract without understanding the player. You cannot evaluate the fit without watching the film. Those are not optional steps in the process. The second argument was that Chris Paul is not good at run blocking, making the contract an overpay for a one-dimensional player. This argument appeared out of nowhere from the same voice that just admitted having no prior knowledge of the player. The logical breakdown here is obvious. How do you assess someone's run-blocking ability specifically and in detail if you could not identify the player 5 minutes before the signing was announced? Beyond the credibility issue, there is a more important football point here. Left guards in today's NFL are evaluated primarily on their pass protection. Keeping the quarterback upright and giving him a clean pocket to operate from is the number one priority at that position in the modern game. If Chris Paul's pass protection grades ranked among the elite at his position in the league, that is precisely what Cleveland needed most going into a season where a young quarterback is taking over the starting role. Run blocking matters, but it does not outrank pocket protection when you are talking about developing a franchise quarterback. The third argument was perhaps the most frustrating: the Browns should have waited for a cheaper option rather than committing to Paul. This sounds reasonable until you look at what the Cleveland offensive line situation actually looked like last season. The pocket collapsed too frequently. The run game struggled because the line could not consistently open holes in the second and third levels. Late in the season, Cleveland was signing players directly off practice squad simply to fill roster spots on the offensive line. That is not a situation where a team can afford to wait around hoping a bargain option falls into their lap. Waiting for a magical cheap solution while a young quarterback is trying to establish himself and find his footing is not a strategy. It is a direct path to repeating the same collapse that cost the franchise momentum and development time across the back half of last season. While several voices in the media were drowning in negativity about this signing, Bush kept the conversation grounded in what actually matters for a team at Cleveland's stage of development. His point was direct and well-reasoned. The Browns are a young team. They brought in a significant group of rookies last season and the majority of those players saw real snaps in meaningful games. That pattern tells you clearly that this roster is still being constructed layer by layer and that the organization is genuinely committed to developing young talent through real playing time rather than hiding them on the bench. In that context, depth is not optional. Depth is survival. Because injuries happen in the NFL at every position and on every roster, and when they hit an offensive line, teams that do not have real, capable players in reserve find themselves scrambling desperately for solutions. Cleveland already experienced that exact crisis last season. They already know what it looks like when an offensive line begins falling apart in the second half of a year. Bush was pointing out that the organization is actively trying to ensure that situation never repeats itself with Shedeur Sanders as the starting quarterback. You bring in legitimate players. You build genuine depth across the offensive line. You make sure the group in front of your quarterback can handle the full load of a season, not just the first 8 weeks when everyone is healthy. This connects directly to Shedeur Sanders and his development as an NFL starter. A young quarterback at the professional level cannot grow, cannot develop the rhythm and timing that makes an offense functional, and cannot build the confidence that carries a team through difficult stretches if he is running for his life on every passing down. Protection is the foundational requirement. Every route concept, every play-action design, every deep shot down the field only functions correctly if the quarterback has enough time to go through his reads and execute the throw. Cleveland is building that foundation right now, and Chris Paul is a real and measurable piece of it. Zoom out from the individual signing and look at the broader pattern of what Andrew Berry is constructing this offseason, because the Chris Paul signing does not exist in isolation. There is a clear and coherent vision behind every move Cleveland is making. The organization is building an offensive line specifically designed to give Shedeur Sanders a legitimate platform to succeed in his first year as the primary starter. That means targeting guards with demonstrated pass protection ability. That means adding genuine depth so the unit does not deteriorate when the inevitable injuries arrive. That means being proactive in identifying value before the rest of the market catches up to it rather than reacting after options have already been exhausted. The critics want to frame every Browns move this offseason as evidence of desperation. But desperation looks like grabbing any available body off the street and hoping the results improve on their own. What Andrew Berry is doing looks fundamentally different from that. He identified a player with a specific and trackable growth trajectory, followed his development through a complete season in Washington, and moved to secure him on a contract before other teams could recognize and act on the same value. That is the definition of good scouting. That is what front office competence actually looks like in practice when a team is committed to a long-term plan. The timing of these moves also matters in a way the critics are not acknowledging. The Browns are not going to have a perfectly finished, fully polished offensive line by the time training camp opens. This is a work in progress and no reasonable person has claimed otherwise. But each piece Berry adds makes the group incrementally stronger. Each signing gives Shedeur more protection, more stability, and more room to operate when he takes his first regular season snap as the Cleveland starter. The goal is not to build a perfect line overnight. The goal is continuous, measurable improvement. And every move this front office is making this offseason represents a concrete step in that direction. The critics are getting louder because they can see it happening. The wall in front of Shedeur Sanders is getting built piece by piece with players who have earned their spots through actual performance. And they understand that when that wall is complete and functional, the central argument that Shedeur cannot succeed in Cleveland loses the foundation it has been standing on. The Cleveland Browns did not make a desperate signing when they brought Chris Paul in from Washington. They made a calculated, intelligent, and well-researched move to address a documented weakness on their offensive line with a player who has a clear track record of improvement and proven pass protection ability at the NFL level. Chris Paul earned his starting job in Washington through direct competition against another investment the team had already made. He held onto that role through consistent performance across a full season. His pass protection grades ranked among the best at the left guard position league-wide. Andrew Berry watched all of it, assessed the value, and moved to secure the player before the rest of the market could do the same. The haters were loud the second the news broke. They admitted they did not know the player, then built an entire case against the signing in real time without watching a single snap. The facts of Chris Paul's development, his competition for a starting role, his growth across the Washington season, and the specific needs of the Cleveland offensive line in front of Shedeur Sanders, none of that found its way into the criticism. Because the criticism was never actually about Chris Paul. Cleveland is building something real around Shedeur Sanders and the evidence is accumulating with every off-season move. That is the story. That is the plan. And the critics know it, which is exactly why the reaction has been as loud and as ungrounded as it has. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what the Browns are building and why the Chris Paul signing makes complete sense for this roster and this quarterback, then make sure you hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss a single move this Cleveland offseason. Every signing, every draft pick, every transaction that affects Shedeur Sanders and the future of this franchise, we are covering all of it with the depth and the detail these stories deserve. The Browns offseason is just getting started, and you do not want to be the last one to know what is happening.